Thank you, Alan, and good evening, everyone. I want to apologize in advance. I have a big head, and so my kippah keeps sliding around. So if it gets distracting enough and I move it to the side, please don't take that as a sign of disrespect. We're kind of wrestling here on today. I want to thank and David Bross, his lovely wife, and I don't want to begin to name a lot of other names because I don't want to miss people, but we recognize as leaders ourselves and our congregation and in other organizations, my wife and me, who's with me, my better half, the brains of the outfit, as I always tell people, of 35 years in June. Yeah, a couple more months, yes, almost. Yes, thank you. Recognize that there is a lot of work that goes into events like this, not just on your whole calendar, but just this one single event. And so we want to say thank you to all of you, to the rabbis and the leaders here of Congregation Bethel, I'm saying it correctly, the JCRC, of course, and all the other organizations. Again, we know that's a lot of work. The food was tremendous. When you're at events like this, I tell my friends, when at a Jewish-led event, you're going to sit next to a Jewish mom who's going to tell you to eat, 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 eat. I try not to eat too much before I have to speak, so if I have struggles, that's the Jewish mom's fault. I won't pick her out in here. But the food was tremendous. Everything's just delicious, and just the hospitality, we appreciate it very much. I have the honor and the privilege of, when I get the opportunity to do these, speaking across the country, whether it's in a black church or in a synagogue or in a university. And so we are always gratified by the hospitality. I tell the kids, even when we're on campus and everything, that they usually serve food because no one's going to come here, speak or talk, but if you say there's pizza, then they'll come, and I wind up eating more than everybody else, so I'm always trying to watch out for that. So again, thank you everyone and for coming here on tonight as well. I know that you have very busy schedules. It's been a long weekend for so many, but that you would take time out of your schedules to come and just be here on tonight. And for those of you who've come to hear what we've had to say, I appreciate that, and we thank you very much. I will be speaking, I was telling this to Sabrina, I believe has been our main hostess, kind of shepherding us here. We will, Yeshiva University, I'll be there tomorrow, I believe. Just as a heads up, we'll be speaking there. This was a couple asked, why did we announce it? We didn't know until like about last week. Sometimes when we're headed somewhere in the country, someone else will see it and they'll say, can you come by? So we got a gracious invitation, so we'll be there. So any of you who have family or friends there, will be speaking there sometime tomorrow evening and sharing with them. There's so many different places that I could start, and so that I'm not rambling. Let me first say that the book that the JCRC and those involved so graciously asked us to send, and those of you who got copies from me that are signed, my chicken scratch, I'm telling you now, it says Blessings, Dumisani, Washington. That's what those two lines that are there. They say to me I should have been a doctor because I have terrible penmanship. Maybe one day I'll get a doctorate degree, and then I can blame that on the reason why I can't write, although that's not the reason at the moment. I'm going to grab my water over there. Is that okay if I scoot and do that? Thank you, sir. So I wrote the book, Zionism in the Black Church, the first edition in 2014. This is slanted, so I want to make sure that I don't. There we go, good, yeah. So the book that's here is the second edition that was published in February of 2021. It's almost 2 years, or a little bit over 2 years. I wrote it as I was inspired to do. This was not something that was on my radar at the time. And again, as it was said in the bio, it was after my first trip to Israel in 2012. I was a guest of the African American Pastors Tour of Christians United for Israel, an organization for which I served as the Diversity Outreach Coordinator for nearly 7 years. I was not on staff at the time. I just had some friends in high places who put me on a trip, always wanted to go. Next thing you know, I'm in Jerusalem. And my first visit to the Kotel, which is the Western Wall, those of you who've gone, I was overwhelmed, so much so that I couldn't go. I just stood in the back part of it as the other pastors approached. because for me, it was an intensely emotional moment. I had heard about other people's experiences, and I was in no way attempting to compare mine to theirs. It's just what happened. And over the course of the time that we were there, I'm kind of an early morning prayer person, kind of grew up that way. I would go to the hotel from our hotel, right, early in the morning, whether taking a cab or just walking through the city. And in my time there, God just put on my heart, among many other things, to strengthen the tie both between the Black and the Jewish community in Israel and Africa. And as I told the congregation as I got back, you have a sense of God saying something to you because you have no idea how you're going to do what he just said. It's enough to intrigue you but frighten you because it's so much bigger than you. So when I returned home, I began to write the first pages of the book, Zionism in the Black Church. Now, when I got to Israel in 2012, what were already passions of mine were Africa and Israel. These things were already there. They were just married in a way that I was not anticipating at the time. And so part of the labor of love in the book was telling I hoped, cohesive story, particularly of the Black American struggle to freedom and its connection to Zionism. In fact, chapters 3 and 4 of the book, 3 is entitled Zionism and the Historic Black Struggle for Freedom. Chapter 4, it unfolds into the pro-Israel legacy of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. So in both chapters, as in most of the book, there's a lot of Black American history that's there. I was raised, I'm the youngest of 7 children, born in Little Rock, Arkansas in the late 1960s, the segregated South. Grew up in California because when my family moved west, I was not even 1 year old. We went straight from North Little Rock to San Francisco, California, where I spent the first 5 years of my life. And then shortly before starting school, my father's job moved out to the Valley, and we moved out to Stockton, California. Either people know nothing about Stockton or bad things about Stockton, and so I love my hometown very much so. And there's there, and in the summer of 1972, where I met my later to be wife. Yes, we met at 5 years old. We've known each other since kindergarten. I fell in love at first sight, and she couldn't stand to look at me. For years, Rabbi, it wasn't until I grew about 5 inches in one summer, and then she began to talk to me, and so that was a whole nother conversation for another day. But I was raised to be very proud of my Black American heritage. See, in my house, we didn't call it Black American heritage, it was just family. There was no such term as Black excellence. It was just you were expected to do the best. And because my parents came from the segregated South, we were taught you have to be twice as good. So we took it as a challenge, so my parents were twice as good at everything. Wasn't something they embraced in terms of discrimination and Jim Crow, but it was a reality that they faced. And so for me, there was nothing negative associated with being Black. It was just, my family was amazing. My community was amazing. My mother knew the people who desegregated Central High School. So Black history was just a reality in my home, in my family. And my parents are both very outspoken people. I still tell the story in the book about how my father, at around 10 years old, stood up to a white landowner who was denigrating and disrespecting his father, got right in his face. But about 10 years old, my father wasn't old enough to realize that he and his father could have died at that moment. It was against the law to speak to a white person in that way. But he let that man know, I don't like the way you're talking to my daddy. So my big mouth comes from my parents, because my mom was even more vocal. And in our church, like most other traditional Black churches, King Solomon Baptist Church we're a member of, there's a great deal of spiritual Zionism, which again was not unique. Those of you who know anything about American musicology, the Negro spirituals almost all set in the Old Testament, almost all of them, right? There's some in the New Testament, walk in Jerusalem just like John, old Mary, old Martha, don't you weep. The Pharaoh's army drowned in the Red Sea. It's kind of a combination of Old and New Testament, but most of them would go down Moses. Joshua fit the battle of Jericho, Elijah rock, shout, all of those things, these are part of what was a spiritual Zionism always in the black community. To this day, Zion is still one of the most common names for church. The AME Zion, the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church. Zion is still the name. Baptist churches, Church of God in Christ, Zion, Jerusalem. This was always part of the black ethos here in the country. So the struggle to freedom that I talk about in chapter 3 deals with not just the spiritual aspect, but the geopolitical reality. Black leaders like W.B. Du Bois, after the turn of the century, before the state of Israel received its independence, he talked about Africa for the Africans, Palestine for the Jews. Marcus Garvey, they called his black nationalist movement Black Zionism. Malcolm X, who had some very negative things to say about Jews and Zionism, basically said, and I can almost directly quote it, he said, Pan-Africanism will do for people of African descent all over the world the same that Zionism has done for Jews all over the world. That was his way of saying the same way we see the Jewish community rallying around the idea of a restored homeland gives hope to people of African descent. This was nothing new. So when we talk about Dr. King in the chapter 4 that unfolds there, we are actually talking about the advocacy now for the state of Israel that is a reality by the 1960s, obviously, because Dr. King is having to not just fight anti-Semitism, but anti-Zionism. 10 days before he's killed, March the 25th, 1968, Dr. King is the honored guest at the 68th Annual Convention of the Rabbinical Assembly for Conservative Judaism. 10 days before he's killed, he's in a conference full of rabbis, Rabbi Joshua Heschel, Rabbi Gendler, and others. And we have the entire transcript. It's on the website, rabbinicalassembly.org, thanks to our conservative rabbi brothers and sisters who they've cataloged it. It's right there. It's 13 pages. You can read the whole thing, and heads up before you read it, and I'm going to remove this. Please, again, I gave you my disclaimer in the beginning, right? Okay, I'm sorry. They didn't do politically correct speech in the 1960s. They said what they meant, and they meant what they said. So heads up before you read it, you might read some offensive terms that for them were not offensive. For example, the word Palestinian is never mentioned because that word wasn't used at that time to refer to the Arabs of the region. Dr. King will say the Arabs and the Israelis, right? He's not erasing anyone. That just wasn't a reality. It wasn't a reality until Yasser Arafat took the reins of the PLO and began to weaponize the term. And when he weaponized it, his first target was the black community in the United States. Why in the world would he target people 8,000 miles away in Chicago and in LA and New York about a conflict that seemingly had nothing to do with them? I'm glad you asked that question. He recognized that if he was going to demonize the Jewish state as a pariah, Zionism as racism, later on Israel apartheid state, he would have zero credibility because of Israel's track record, not the least of which was Golda Meir, whom the president of Tanzania at the time, Julius Nyerere, called the mother of Africa. Israel's record was clear. So if he was going to demonize Israel effectively, he would have to have standing next to him people who represented civil rights in the modern era. And who better than black leaders in the United States? He couldn't pick off the older ones, so he went to the Eldridge Cleavers, who was in his 20s, to the Angela Davises, to the Stokely Carmichaels, later called Kwame Ture. Why? Because he had to sell something that was not true, but the people who would receive it would be thinking emotionally, not rationally. So what did he do? He went to the more radical fringe and said, the same way that you are being oppressed, these Israelis are doing this to us in the land. It wasn't true, but it felt real. I tell the story in the book, and our organization, the Institute for Black Solidarity with Israel, just as one example. There's a Substack that we have that's called Africa Israel Weekly, and we released a video not too long ago. And we focused in on Eldridge Cleaver, who in the late 1960s was the Minister of Information for the Black Panthers, which was born in Oakland, California. It's funny, I was a little kid around there in the Bay Area. Had I no idea who the Black Panthers were, I was just a little kid. I didn't realize those things until later on. And he, Eldridge Cleaver, probably the most dynamic, iconic member of the organization, was a dyed-in-the-wool anti-Zionist because of the propaganda that he'd been taught until he fled and for 7 years lived in Cuba and other communist countries throughout Africa, Europe, and Asia, and got himself an education, as they used to say on the street where I'm from. He met Yasser Arafat in Algiers in 1969, who then began to teach him the ways of anti-Zionism. But when he saw slaves in Algeria and Mauritania and other places that he went, when he actually saw the human rights abuses, and when he did a deeper dive, he came back basically a Zionist, defending Israel and the Jewish people, even writing op-eds. He used his platform, his own groups, if you will, shunned him and kicked him to the curb because they saw him as a sellout. And the reality of it is he had seen the light. It's one of many stories that we have. He lived to tell the story. And so Dr. King, the year before Yasser Arafat took over is when Dr. King was killed. Dr. King is killed in 1968. Arafat takes over the PLO in 1969. And Dr. King, when asked about the conflict, is when the rabbi who just gave that quote, I see Israel, and never mind saying it, as one of the great outposts of democracy in the world and a marvelous example of what can be done, how a desert land almost can be transformed into an oasis of brotherhood and democracy. Peace for Israel means security, and that security must be a reality, full stop. 10 days later, gone. I'm so glad we have the words for posterity, because in this time of great disinformation, many people would not believe it. As a matter of fact, our group that we took to South Africa, we have an initiative called the Peace Initiative, which is an acronym for Plan for Education, Advocacy, and Community Engagement. We've recruited Black young men and women from across the country. They are doing a 9-month study. Each month we come together, we unpack different topics and different themes, if you will, and we take 2 major trips. We say December, the motherland, June, the Holy Land. So we were in South Africa in December. We will be, God say the same, in June, we will be in Israel. And when we were there, among the many things that we did, we traveled to Cape Town and we went to the Jewish Museum there. We were shown around the beautiful shul, the original one, the new one, just the artifacts is an amazing thing. And at the end of it, there's a theater about maybe half the size of this auditorium. And they show you a film. And that film features Nelson Mandela and other Black leaders who fought against apartheid, giving praise, among other things, to the Jewish community who were indispensable in the fight against apartheid. He sounded just like Dr. King in the United States. The difference is that Dr. King was speaking in the 60s, he was speaking in the 90s. And my daughter-in-law, who's from South Africa, she actually just sent a video. It was an AP, Associated Press video, and I'd heard of them, seen them before. It was May the 7th, 1994, and Nelson Mandela had just visited one of the more known shuls, synagogues in Cape Town. And he emerged from that and gave a little impromptu press conference because Mandiba can't go anywhere without a huge entourage. So when he comes out, there's press and there's cameras and there's recordings and everything. And he let the people know, because obviously they weren't allowed in the shul because it was during Shabbat. So they come outside and everybody's standing out there waiting. And Nelson Mandela stands there on the steps and says what he said over and over again. We want to thank the Jewish community for its invaluable contribution to the development of our country. They don't tell you that on college campuses. They tell you it was an apartheid state. They tell you Nelson Mandela's sensitive statements towards the Palestinians, and he made them. He said, we know that our peace is not complete without the peace of the security and the freedom of the Palestinians. He did say that, but that's half of the quote. And he said, and we cannot conceive of Israel withdrawing without security of borders. The same thing that Dr. King said. There was no conflict in what he said, but half the story is told. So our organization winds up often telling the whole story. I shared with you, as I get ready to close, that I came from a very proud tradition as a Black American. Not proud, arrogant, but very much knowing who I was. So there was no question. I understood who my family was. I understood my parents, all of those things, right? So it was never a question. There was just you, like I said, you expected and you did and you achieved and you accomplished is what you did, right? My mother graduated from Scipio A. Jones High School, the only high school there in Arkansas at the time that took Black students. And it was the pride of Arkansas. I mean, doctors, lawyers, politicians, everything. Yeah, absolutely. They prided themselves. They recognized what Jim Crow was. They recognized what segregation was. So they prided themselves on competing and doing the best. They would oftentimes out-academically perform the other white schools in the area. And they took great pride in that. They said, all right, we'll show you. This is who we are. There's great debate about even what integration was and what it was not. I don't have time to unpack that now. Maybe David and I will touch on that a little bit here. But I bring that up because in the midst of all of those things, being brought up in that way and the love for Israel and all those things, when I then heard Israel denigrated as a Jim Crow state, as an apartheid state, especially we having family in South Africa, it lit a fire in me. For two reasons. Number one, I knew what those things were. My family has experienced those things, so that was a bald-faced lie. Number two, Israel, particularly in the region, the greatest friend to Africa and the Middle East. Rabbi so adeptly pointed out that Israel, because of its technology, because of its democracy, has much more in common with the West, particularly Western Europe. Here's the irony. Where is anti-Semitism at record levels? Number four, in the West, in France, in Spain. While the Abraham Accords, the UAE has just issued a decree that they're taking anti-Semitism out of their school books, but it's being infused in ours. It's a completely upside down world. It should not be this way, but this is what's happening. And we recognize that what has to push back are Black voices speaking the truth. So, one of the things I say in my book, and connected to this, the heritage part, we're talking about telling the whole story, authentic history. I use an example of Black Wall Street. Tulsa's Black Wall Street. There's many Black Wall Streets in the early 1900s, went all the way to the 1960s. And some of you may recognize it was actually talked about a great deal in Congress a couple of years ago. The Tulsa Black Wall Street was decimated in 1921 in a race massacre. And we talk about this often in the book. We talk about it in our lectures. That's often the story that's known. What's not known is that the residents in less than 2 years rebuilt it. And it was bigger and more prosperous than ever. And we tell the young people, when I give you half the story, I'm emotionally manipulating you. Because if I tell you it was destroyed, that's just another story about how Black people were dispossessed in the United States of America. But when I tell you those same Black folks had to fight a 2-year battle on 2 levels, the county level and the state level, to retain the land, because the same people who destroyed it tried to take the land from them, but they owned the land, and they had Black attorneys fought and won and retained it, and it continued to thrive and prosper. It was more prosperous after it was destroyed. These are the types of things we have in common with our Jewish brothers and sisters. When you gather together at the Seder, you don't gather around to commiserate how terrible Pharaoh was. The focus is not the pharaohs, it's not the Egyptians. The focus is the God who delivered you from bondage. This was the same thing. We didn't sing Go Down Moses because we didn't have nothing else to talk about. We were expressing the same hope in the same God. So what happens when I manipulate people with disinformation, I give them half a story to keep them in bondage. So much of what our organization does is tell the whole story. Last thing, David, I promise. In a couple of weeks, my wife and I will return to Jerusalem for what our partners will be leading at Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs, called a Africa, Israel, Arab conference, a summit, a security conference. It'll be on water security, food security, obviously, against counterterrorism, all of those things. Because once again, as Rabbi so adeptly said, the nations in the region are seeing Israel for the light to the nations that it is, and is needing that help. The number one area of terrorism now is the African continent, and the number one state sponsor of terrorism is Iran, which just forged a deal with Saudi Arabia. This has ramifications everywhere. And the nations that will be represented at that summit, some don't even have diplomatic relations with it. Djibouti, Somaliland, Sudan, which is in the process of establishing peace. This is a moment in time, and the Black American voice, more important now than ever before, because there has been a leadership from the days of Frederick Douglass as the ambassador to Haiti to now. There has been a call, and it's a call particularly now as Israel continues to emerge. This is much of what our organization does, and we'll share more of it with you as well, but this is part of the passion of what we do and why we do it. So thank you so much for having this on tonight.
Once again, good evening, everyone. My name is David Bross. I am the co-chair of the Israel Advocacy Initiative of the JCRC of Southern New Jersey, along with my good friend, Alan Moldoff, from whom you heard already. Again, I want to thank everyone for being here tonight. This was a very, very special evening. I have to thank my wife, Karen, for hearing me talk about this man for the last 2 years. Singing his praises, but now you know why. This is someone who has something very important to say, who's doing great work, and he gave us some insight already. There's a lot I could talk about, but time is short, and so am I. And by the way, I could use a booster seat, Sabrina, but I'll just sit down and begin some questions. We're going to have a little discussion. It'll be maybe 15, 20 minutes. Pastor Washington has already covered a lot of what I was going to ask him, but I'm going to ask him to elaborate, and I'm sure he'll have more to say. And if we have time, we'll take some questions from the audience. Okay. You touched on a very sensitive subject, and that's anti-Semitism coming from the Black community. There's been a lot in the news in the last year. We all know about Louis Farrakhan, a classic Jew hater. But now we've been hearing about Kanye West, about Kyrie Irving, and a film that he endorsed, and others. And you already touched on this, Pastor, but I want you to give us your take on this state of affairs and how best should this problem be dealt with.
One of the things that I often do as a caveat is that questions like these, it's so layered because it touches on so many different areas at the same time. So when I made the statement that and this is according to people much smarter than me who've been studying this for a long time, anti-Semitism in the Western world at levels not seen since near the Second World War. That because and obviously in the United States as well, left side of the aisle, right side of the aisle, academia, media, unfortunately what continues to bring people together is a hatred for Jews, hatred for Israel, right? So because that is the case, since it's been measured for decades, the anti-Semitism levels within the Black American community have consistently been slightly higher than some of the other ethnic groups. And there's different reasons for that. I even unpack that in the book as well as to why that is, what that reality actually is, even with all the deep ties between the Black and the Jewish community. Part of what we are experiencing now is A, a rise in anti-Semitism in the nation, sadly, and then B, within segments of the Black community there as well, with voices, as you've already said. It was just Louis Farrakhan, the leader of Nation of Islam, just as an example, who will be 90 years old in a couple of weeks, I believe. They had their annual Savior's Day event in Chicago. And in that particular event, I didn't watch it, saw some of the clips that were coming my way. There was a surrogate of his who was dispelling, just as an example, the libel against Louis Farrakhan as being an anti-Semite. And as he made his case, he began to talk about other people who were called anti-Semites from the Jewish community. Different names, some things I'd heard before, some I hadn't had before. And the short version of the story is that he got to literally Adolf Hitler and Henry Ford, if you know who he is, Google him, Protocols of the Elders of Zion, and said, just like those people were falsely accused, I said, my God, If Adolf Hitler is not an anti-Semite, I don't know who is an anti-Semite. But it was a certain amount of gaslighting. Obviously, what was going on was saying that just like Adolf Hitler is okay, right? And this has been going on for decades. None of this is new. Does he speak for the majority of the black community? Absolutely not. I talked about this in several other interviews as well, that A. Louis Farrakhan has great respect within much of the black community for much of what the Nation of Islam has done in the black community, reducing recidivism rates, working with the black men, families, all of those things, positive things. But the problem is that it also comes attached with, as you were saying there, how that connects to Kanye West, much of what he's beginning to say about the Jewish people. Farrakhan's been saying that since the 1970s. And when we would say, I wrote about it in the book, and people would dismiss, oh, Ibsen is, you're just attacking him and he's not important. And I said, no, he's influential. And so Kanye West, I'm old enough to be Kanye's father. So he's spouting the same things, and this is the danger, right? This is why both history and legacy is so important. This is why I will take pains to tell you, here's what Nelson Mandela said about the Jewish community. Here's what Dr. King said about the Jewish community, and let you know that that still is the prevailing mentality, unfortunately, in the area. Could you imagine what Joseph Goebbels could have done if he had Twitter? And I'm not even being facetious. Just think about what social media does. What if those same people had those types of tools? And that's where we're living now. This is actually what's happening now. So we talk about it, we educate, and when we have these conversations in the black community, I can talk to pastors and leaders all the time. Not only do they not speak for, often some of these things aren't known. We may unpack a couple of those things as well in terms of other things that on the surface look okay, but underneath it is a great deal of anti-Semitism and everything. So, and there's another part that you'd asked about that, but I hope I addressed the first part of it and everything. Did I miss one of those? Did I do it? Okay, yes, sir.
One thing you may have missed, and we're not holding back here tonight. Tell us what you think about Black Lives Matter.
It's not so much about what I think. So, well, again, we deal with factual information. Black Lives Matter is an organization that was started in 2013 after the acquittal of the man who killed Trayvon Martin in Florida. It didn't gain national prominence until 2014-15 after the death of Michael Brown in Ferguson. Right? It started as a hashtag. After 2013, it begins to take fire in 2014-15 with all the protests and everything. And then what is it introduced to that by a professor, I believe, but it took hold in the street, the hashtag Ferguson to Palestine. This was our first eyebrow raise as an organization because we recognize that propaganda. Right? Something that should be dealing with police brutality is somehow 8,000 miles away again in the Middle East. What in the world does Mike Brown have to do with that? And the answer to the question is nothing. But that was the agenda of the manipulation. My son wrote an article a couple of years after that called the manipulation of black pain. To go to these families and then tell them that the reason why your kid was shot was because Israel trains police all over the world and Israel is racist. You following me here? And does Israel help train police? Absolutely. Ever since 2001, after 9/11, Israel, which is the best at counterterrorism, helps train police and law enforcement around the world, including in Africa, right? Literally around the world, right? So to blame it on the Israelis, right, is not only is it not true, it's the manipulation of, and then on top of that to raise tens of millions of dollars. To this day, Black Lives Matter has, in terms of corporate pledges, almost $50 billion in corporate pledges. I'm from the black community. I ain't seen an ordinary school, black-owned business.
Did you say 50 billion?
Billion.
Billion.
$50 billion in corporate pledges. There are Black Lives Matter members who are asking where the money is. Chapters who are asking where the money is. So for the purpose, I wrote an article about this. You can go and read it as well on Africa Israel Weekly on our Substack. Go to ibsi.org and you'll see Africa Israel Weekly. We actually unpack all of this as well. We talk about where the name came from, what the organization is, how there's 4 different entities, the Black Lives Matter Foundation Network, something, another. There's the hashtag, there's the organization. It's like a 4-tiered organization, right? And part of the bait and switch is I act like I'm concerned about the black community, but then I help push curriculum in the schools telling people Israel's an apartheid state, committing genocide against the Palestinians, all of these things. But I do it under the cover and the auspices of Black Lives Matter. So you're afraid to push back on me because if you push back, you're racist. See how that game works?
That's what's been going on. And other than Israelis being demonized, who pays the most? Black community. Can I say one last thing? The signature move of BLM was defund the police. That's another way you knew it was fake. Watch me. That was in George Floyd killed in May 2020. Gallup did a poll in August 2020 and asked several thousand black people, were you in favor of it? 81% against it. Most of them wanted more police. We're not stupid. We know what a racist cop is. Get him off the force and prosecute him. But you're going to take police out of South LA? You're just going to take the police out of Baltimore? We're not idiots. So they were not speaking for us. That's just one example. I can go list after list. So the anti-Israel, anti-Jewish part was just more par for the course. Not only are you not speaking for me, and I've been black all my life, you have the audacity and the unmitigated gall to bring the Israeli-Palestinian conflict into this situation that needs to be discussed. So that's what I think about Black Lives Matter. Oh, I'm sorry. Can I tell you, when I have these live events in black communities, we get almost zero pushback in the black community. Can I help you? Most of the black leaders that we'll talk to, they're not aware of the anti-Israel stuff because that's not on the highlight. That's the fine print. So when you're concerned about police brutality, that's your focus. And when someone tells you they're concerned as well, they stand with you, then you think you guys are in solidarity, but they're taking that notoriety and doing these other things in your name. So I just wanted to say that part as well, yes.
No, that's fine. In fact, if you Google Black Lives Matter, not hard to find, you'll find some deeply anti-Zionist propaganda.
They've never
very
hidden
disturbing.
it. Nothing that, when I say fine print, meaning they don't say that in the rally. But if you just, they've been very, very open about the fact. Defund, don't help Israel, destroy Israel-U.S. relationship, the whole thing. They've always been very, very open about it, right? Even other members aren't aware at times because they're on the street doing work. But these other things are true, unfortunately.
Sabrina, how are we doing on time? Okay. Again, you covered a lot of ground in a short period of time because you're such a pro. Any other examples in recent years of more promising developments in black-Jewish relations?
Despite everything that I said before, black-Jewish relations continue on. See, I have the privilege of not just having to deal in the virtual world, social media and everything. I get the privilege of actually talking to real people on the ground across the country. Black pastors, rabbis, community leaders, everything, who continue to do amazing work. It's funny. Many of you in the room know about the history and legacy of Julius Rosenwald and Booker T. Washington. Those two men at the turn of the century who developed what we now continue to call Rosenwald schools. Julius Booker T. Washington, of course, a philanthropist, entrepreneur and the leader of Tuskegee Institute, and just amazing. He's the man who coined the term Negro Wall Street, actually. He's the one who actually came up with it. He went to Tulsa and visited and everything, just an icon and a pillar within the black community. Julius Rosenwald of Sears Roebuck fame, multi-billionaire, even by those standards in the early 1900s, and they come together and build schools throughout the segregated South for millions of black students who did not have them. Not only that, Julius Rosenwald continued to fund, I'm saying this for a reason, I'm getting to your point. He continued to fund black education beyond high school, what's called the Rosenwald Fellows, right? Including people like Maya Angelou, long after he's gone, James Baldwin, Lawrence Jacobs, the photographer, and on and on and on, Langston Hughes, right? These people actually went to school on this Jewish man's philanthropy, right? This is known for those recognized history. They didn't come together because he said, hey, I'm black, you're Jewish, let's do something. The synergy was organic. And it happened before Dr. King was even born. Dr. King and Joshua Heschel weren't even around yet. What has happened in this country for over a century is the black and Jewish communities have found each other. And often, Dr. King said himself, and I'm paraphrasing, there's been no other ethnic group more present in the Negro struggle for justice than the Jew. And that was true before he was born. So what I find is it's still happening. I see it in Chicago. I see it in LA. I give you example after example of black and Jewish communities that continue to work and do all this stuff. Yes, social media, bad, all these things are horrible. Anti-Semitism, record levels, all that is true. All these things can be true at the same time. This is what's going on, unfortunately, with all the rhetoric. But on the ground, Black and Jewish communities continue to do amazing work together. So a lot of our organization does. We don't try to create it. We just actually give voice to it. So here's what you need to know. Here are the people that you need to know, and this is why you need to know who they are.
Well, your organization, IBSI, has really been a great leader in that regard. I've been following you now for a few years. I support your organization. I urge everyone here, go on the website, go to Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Institute for Black Solidarity with Israel. I'm going to, plug it because they're doing amazing work. How come we don't hear about these positive developments more? What do you think?
It was Barack Obama who said, if it bleeds, it leads. Human nature. We gravitate to bad news. This is why the traffic jam is not even the accident. It's the people watching the accident on the freeway. They want to see, is there blood? Is there, Yeah, there's a small percentage who want to see if it's their family, but the rest of the people, they just want to see, oh, wow, look at that. And they're causing another accident, right? Human nature, right? So people don't want to hear about things like people building community centers. And it's unfortunate. It's part of our fallen nature, right? But it is true. So this is one of the reasons why we don't hear about it. We want to hear about the negative. We want to hear about the sensational. And let me take an opportunity to say this very briefly. In as much as we attempt to speak truth to power in our organization, and we try to be very open and very honest, I'll very openly talk about Black Lives Matter. I'll very openly talk about the negative, the anti-Semitism, the anti-Semitic part of who Louis Farrakhan is. But we'll also be very honest about what's going on. In our opinion, the greatest incubator of Jew hatred in this country is not the Nation of Islam or Black Lives Matter. It's colleges and universities across this country. These kids, right? This is where I usually get in trouble and escorted out. See, and last I checked, the Black community didn't control the colleges and universities. Right? Can we just be real? Right? Oh, there's HBCUs. You know, it's funny. Anti-Semitism, almost non-existent on historically Black colleges and universities. Isn't that amazing? That if there was a Black community that had a problem with the Jews, why hasn't Howard and Spelman, they should be erupting with all kind of free Palestine. But amazingly, no. It's at Berkeley, UCLA, University of Michigan. And last I checked, Black folks don't control any of those organizations.
Rutgers, Brandeis.
We can go on down the list from Ivy League to the community colleges. These kids are being brainwashed to believe that Israel is a Nazi state. That's the real, even more prominent tragedy here. Kids going to school with one mind and graduating, talking about free Palestine. They couldn't find Gaza on a map, but they had been, right? This is the tragedy, but it doesn't get talked about because it bleeds, it leads. It's easier to talk about Farrakhan than it is to talk about what's going on at UC Irvine. Now, if he was the provost at UC Irvine, we'd talk about it. But he's not. Can I get really real? It's white progressives that run those organizations. Oh, no, please, no. I'm not making a racist statement. I'm saying if we're going to talk about Black anti-Semitism in the Black community, we talk about the whole, man, so you don't give a high part of the story? Kanye didn't learn that at UCLA. But they're learning. If you thought Kanye is saying it's bad, there are professors who have thousands of students. Here's the thing. You can have a pro-Israel event on a college campus, and I told you I'll be at Yeshiva University. There's no anti-Semitism there, but I spotlight universities, right? And as hope we have an amazing time. But NYU is one of the most anti-Semitic campuses on the They hosted Layla Khaled, who is a terrorist. She hijacked a plane. My wife graduated from San Francisco State University. They took taxpayer dollars to fly to Israel and meet with the PFLP. We paid for it as taxpayers. Those people are still working at San Francisco State University. Why? Because it doesn't get the press. Kanye does. Kyrie, see what I'm saying? And the danger of that, oh, are you saying don't talk about, no, call it out. You heard me talk about Farrakhan, but if you don't call out the whole thing, you're doing a disservice. Because after that pro-Israel event on the college campus, but you have an anti-Semitic professor who's teaching anti-Semitic curriculum and is making it part of the grade, either you agree with him or her, or you're not gonna pass this This is what's happening. It's been going on for a long time, but it doesn't get discussed. So, whatever you asked, I just answered something else.
I think you knocked it out of the park. I'm going to ask one more question. We'll end on a more positive note, if we will. You talked about your trips to Israel. You've been there many times. I know you were there last month. You're going again this month. And this being the 75th anniversary of Israel's independence, I'm sure the audience would love to hear anything else you might have to say that you haven't already said about your experiences in Israel, what has inspired you, and anything you'd like to share with us to close.
Our organization teaches that the first ever Africa-Israel summit was when the Queen of Sheba traveled 1,500 miles to visit Solomon in Jerusalem 3,000 years ago. That's how long that relationship has been going. And she didn't go for water, drip irrigation technology, nothing. She had plenty of money, plenty of power. She had probably more money than Solomon did at the time. She actually brought, the scripture says 120 talents of gold. I think I did the math, it's like 4 tons of gold. How wealthy do you have to be to give a tribute of 4 tons of gold? She broke him off a little something with 4 tons of gold, right? Okay. Isaiah chapter 2, and I have to tell the audience in here, one of the many iconic moments in Isaiah, starts off, and the mountain of the Lord's house shall be exalted above every mountain, and all the nations shall flow to it. And they will say, come, let us go up into the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, and he will teach us of his ways, and we will walk in his paths. For out from Zion goes forth the law, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. One of the most sung songs, if I could say it that way, in the black church. I'm going to lay down my burdens down by the riverside, down by the riverside, down by the riverside. I'm going to lay down my burdens down by the riverside and study war no more. The next verse after that, and nations shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they study war anymore. The Hebrew prophets, Dr. King quoted that more than he quoted the Constitution. That has been in the ethos and the blood of black Americans and the Africans for centuries. When you go to the land, all over the land, but especially in Jerusalem, and you see people from all over the world, you see the reality of Isaiah chapter 2 over and over again. Folks from Nigeria, from Kenya, from South Korea, from China, you name it. Christians, non-Christians, people come. To this day, it is an amazing thing. I've been there 12, 13, I can't remember how many times I've been there. Never gets tired, never gets old. I go to the hotel every opportunity I can get. It is an amazing place for all of these spiritual reasons, on top of the fact that I'm talking about leader in virtually every technology. Your phone in your hand would not exist if it wasn't for the Israelis. The processor in your computer. I'm talking about not just R&D centers, but actually making the technology there and then sending it out. This tiny nation of some 8 million people. One of my friends, Carl Scaresi, is a nephrologist who used to work at Rambam Hospital, who discovered the cause of African-American kidney disease and is working on the cure. Why is this Ashkenazi Jewish rabbi/doctor doing this? Why? Because he'll tell you, because Torah commands me to seek out these inequities and these inequalities and to find out why this is happening and repair the world. You feel it when you're in Jerusalem. You see it. It's no more of a perfect place than any other place, but it's no other place like it on the earth. And this is why Arab and African nations are marching to Zion. They want what they see happening there. So a short answer to your question, David, it's an amazing place for all of those reasons, and the region is more and more seeing it, and I'll say it again, and the Black American voice must be the leading one when it comes to what's happening there like never before. I'll give you a quick little history lesson and I'll be done. The reason why Frederick Douglass took the post of becoming the ambassador for Haiti wasn't just because he was representing the United States. That was his first reason, but he also wanted to see a successful Black republic, his words, not mine. Why did Dr. King fly away to Ghana when Kwame Nkrumah was actually installed as the prime minister in 1957, when Dr. King had a few other things going on already over here? Was because he recognized that he needed to be there to witness that moment. And on, there's been Black leadership here where Africa is concerned for a while. Our organization seeks to see that restored because it's been waning. Can I tell you why? And you didn't ask why, I'm going to tell you why anyway. You know why? One of the reasons why you haven't had organized Black voices where Africa is concerned since 1994 Rwanda. I'm going to tell you why. That as the anti-Israel, pro-Palestinian voice took over in academia, it sucked all the oxygen out of the room. It made the Israeli-Palestinian conflict the biggest thing in the world. So nobody talks about the million slaves in Libya or the 43,000 Christians in Igbo who've been slaughtered in Nigeria over the last 12 years. Or the slaves that are still in Sudan and in Mauritania, the slaves that are in Qatar. No one talks about those things in large part because Israel-Palestine, Israel-Palestine. Dr. King then had the adeptness to fight for civil rights here, but still be very concerned about what was going on in the continent. And then fought for Israel's independence as well, fought for Israel's right. Our organization seeks to restore that. That has always been the case. That's what Jerusalem and Israel means to me.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Sabrina,
Yes.
can we take some questions?
Well, it depends on who wants to go for dessert. So, we could take one or two questions if you're all interested.
Anybody? Do we have another mic?
We have a mic right there. Take that one.
Please tell us your name and ask your question.
Hi, my name is Roxanne Lightfoot, and my question, well, you talk about Nelson Mandela. I was born in Ethiopia, Eritrea, and at the time, King Haile Selassie was in control. And while we were stationed there, he actually petitioned Israel to send a colonel over to train his troops. So that was a beautiful connection there as well. And that was the initial point where my family was introduced to Colonel El-Hanani was his name, and his kids and my sisters, we all became friends. And so that was my introduction to Israel, because we go to Israel all the time now to visit her, leaving Friday. But my question is what do you think about the correlation between the view of King Haile Selassie as the Lion of Judah and the ideology of Black Hebrew Israelites?
They're two very separate things.
Okay.
Yes, ma'am. So Haile Selassie, for those of you who know, he's called the Lion of the Tribe. That's actually the beginning of the Rastafarian religion. They see Haile Selassie as a descendant from Solomon and literally the king of Israel, the king of Judah, the Lion of Judah. They actually call him that. And they begin to regard him as a messianic figure in that way, right? And that's what the Rastafarian religion actually is based on, right? Black Hebrew Israelites is a very, very separate thing. It really has not anything to do with Haile Selassie or the whole Rastafarian religion. And I hope I'm answering your question. Yeah, it has its different roots and different things. There's different splinter groups as well. The original, if I were to say, Black Hebrew Israelite group that's here in the States began in the 1800s, shortly after the Civil War. And there was different people who actually started it. One of the gentlemen thought that black people were the actual Israelites, who brought as slaves. Some didn't necessarily believe they were Israelites, but they were actually identified with Judaism and with Israel in that way, and started a kind of a parallel movement, which has continued on to this day. Most of them very peaceful and not in any way anti-Semitic. Unfortunately, what most people know in the room from social media is the radical group that hates Jews, hates Israel, praises Hitler. That's a separate thing from that other group. But yes, ma'am, and this is part of the confusion, because there's many people who use that term now, and unfortunately, some of them the shooting in Jersey City, 2019, by two people who subscribed to a radical Black Hebrew Israelite. The Manse stabbing, I believe it was, there is another black gentleman who subscribed to that mentality. So that's how many people have been introduced to that. But it's a very separate thing than the group that's led by Rabbi Capers Fune, who's based in Chicago, that has its roots back from the 1800s. So I hope I'm answering that. Yes,
I wasn't
ma'am.
sure if there was a correlation, but thank you for clearing that
Yes,
up.
ma'am, absolutely, no problem.
There's a question over here, sir. You want to tell us your name and your question?
Mr. Washington, my name is Aaron Roller. I want to thank you so much for your words of inspiration. My question is, I don't want you to let us off the hook too easy. What can we here do to extend friendship to the Black community, as the Jewish community today? As a community and as individuals.
Absolutely. So I get that question all the time. I really do. It's usually one of the first questions that's asked, which speaks to the heart of our Jewish brothers and sisters. And what I always try to say is to keep it short. Continue to do what you're doing, your community outreach, continue your tzedakah, is that is, your giving, all of the, do the things that you do. You continue to be the Jewish people, be a light to the nations, right? And when you see the opportunity to actually continue that in another way, maybe here's an initiative, continue to do those very things, right? I would say that. And in particular, there's a rabbi friend of mine who lives in the Boston area, particularly after the Kyrie Irving, the Kanye West, and then he reached out to me, he said, Pastor, could you please come speak to our group? They're getting very discouraged. They're seeing all of this Jew hatred, and they're not sure what to do. They're starting to shut down, and that was the biggest red flag to me. Not in any type of patriarchal way to them to dictate to them, but to say to them, please continue to prayerfully do what you do in the communities, right? Do what you continue to do. So my answer to the question is continue to do what you're doing. Have events like this. Do what you're doing in the communities. It's amazing. There's a black pastor, colleague of mine in Chicago, who does amazing work that's there. He has a very close relationship with the Jewish community. When the rabbi, the rabbi of the shul that he works with many of them, of the shul, when his son did his bar mitzvah, and I guess the tradition is that there's a certain amount of money that they receive and they get to designate it. He gave it to this pastor for this building of this park there in South Chicago, right? Again, these things happen all the time. My thing is continue to do those things, right? That's what I would say. Support organizations like me, ibsi.org, go to the organization, yeah? But when we do that, we say the same thing to the black people when we're there. We're black pastors. Say, pastors, if you see what we're doing and it resonates with you, put us on a line item on your church. Give, help. We're a nonprofit. So we tell them those types of things. Continue to support those organizations that you know are doing the work, and don't support organizations that you know aren't doing the work, which is why when I talked about the Black Lives Matter thing, I said, yeah, okay, because we had Jewish friends who would come to us, what do you think about this? And we tell them the truth, and often, our greatest strength is our greatest weakness. The biggest pushback we got was from our Jewish friends. What do you mean Black Lives Matter? We say, here's all the receipts, as they say on the street. Here's what you need to know, right? And our pushback was from our Jewish friends, but we got it. They wanted to help. They didn't know that the giving was actually to an organization that was trying to destroy their country, right? So avoid those organizations, right? And continue to do what you do. I hope I've answered your question, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you for telling the truth. I know there's some other questions, but time is running late, and we're going to conclude the program at this time.
Thank you, everybody. That was an incredibly powerful conversation. Rabbi Kyle, Pastor Washington, rabbis, chairs, committee, JCRC board members, and all of you who have joined us this evening, thank you for making this event so special. Please know that Pastor Washington will be outside in the lobby, and you can continue to ask him questions. And we wish everyone a good evening, and we hope to see many of you at our upcoming events and observances listed in the back of your program and in the flyers out there. Have a lovely evening, enjoy dessert, and drive safely. Thank you, everyone.